Now let me ask, have you had enough functions for one day? Of course. I'm sure the answer must be a resounding no. So, let's look at a unique set of functions called group functions. Here, we're going to differentiate between single row and multiple row functions. We're going to use the sum and average functions for numeric calculations. We're going to use the count function. We're going to use the count with the asterisk. We're going to use the min and the max functions, even with non-numeric fields. We'll look at the group by, and even identify when the having clause could be used. We'll list the order of precedence for evaluating where, group by, and having clauses. We'll look at the maximum depth for nesting group functions. We're going to calculate the standard deviations of a data set. We'll explain the concept of multidimensional analysis. And we'll look at grouping sets, cube, and rollup. So, what are group functions? Simply put, these are also called multiple row functions, as they return one result per group of rows processed. One thing that stands out most with group functions and what makes it a little more user-friendly is that group functions ignore all null values, with the exception, of course, of one, which is the count function. As we talk about these functions, let's start with the sum and then move on to the average. The sum calculates total amount stored in the numeric column for a group of rows. Naturally, the sum function returns the sum or total value of the selected numeric field. Here we find ourselves looking at the average. The average, or AVG, returns the average value of the selected numeric fields. Now, let's look at the tricky one, which is count. As previously noted, count is the trickiest of all group functions, but only because rows with null values are not included. You have to use an asterisk rather than a field name if you want to include null values here. The count function returns the number of rows containing a value in an identified field. So you see how this could be helpful. Let's look at an example with the asterisk in this count function. Here you see we've included the asterisk in the argument to count the number of rows. Now we're about to look at the max, min, and standard deviation functions. The select max is helpful in identifying a maximum value. Notice here, the example points to the highest profit. Alternatively, the min function returns the smallest value. Now maybe you're interested in the analytics side of database administration. If so, the standard deviation or stdev function is especially helpful when compiling research statistics from a database. Now that we've explored some of the more popular group functions, what really makes them so loved by database users is that they can be combined. When we talk about grouping sets, this is what enables you to perform multiple group by clauses within one single query. Cube is a little bit unique. You can use the cube function for all possible combinations of the columns included. Let's turn our attention now to the rollup. The rollup lets you accumulate subtotals. There's no fruit in this rollup. In conclusion, the average, sum, standard deviation, and variance functions are used only with numeric fields. The count, max, and min functions can be applied to any data type. The average, sum, max, min, standard dev, and variance functions collectively ignore null values. As a default, the average, sum, max, min, count, and standard deviation and variance functions include duplicate values. Remember that the group by clause is used to divide table data into groups. If a select clause contains both an individual field name and a group function, the field name must also be included in a group by clause. A having clause is used to restrict groups in a group function. Now, remember As a helpful tip, group functions can be nested to a depth of only 2. The inner function is always performed first, and the results of the inner function are used as an input for the outer function. Now, let's wrap up with what we discussed with standard deviation in grouping sets. The standard deviation and variance functions are generally used to perform statistical analysis on a set of data. Grouping set operations can be used to perform multiple group by aggregations in a single query. The cube extension of the group by calculates aggregations for all possible combinations or groups of columns included. Remember, there was no fruit in the roll-up extension of the group by, which calculates increasing levels of accumulated subtotals or column list provided. Composite columns and concatenated groupings can be used in grouping sets, cube, and roll-up operations. The group ID. This function helps eliminate duplicate grouping results. Thank you so much for joining us this week.